In front of everyone, someone shouted, "No criminals here!" And I swear it was like being stabbed in the chest. The silence that followed seemed to crush me, as if every look were another sentence against me. But what no one imagined was that very night, I would be the only person capable of saving a life. And it was precisely in the midst of that humiliation that it all happened. My name is Michael Johnson, and whenever I say that name, it feels like I need to add a footnote, as if people can't just see me as Michael, but how Michael, the ex-convict. It's funny how one word, one label, can completely change the way others see you. But before all this happened, before I bore this label, I was just an ordinary kid from Ohio, trying to find my place in the world. I grew up in a simple neighborhood where everyone knew each other. My mother, Linda, was the backbone of our family. She worked 2 jobs. In the mornings, serving coffee at a roadside diner. In the evenings, cleaning offices downtown. She would come home tired, smelling of hand sanitizer, but she always had a smile for me and my younger brother, Daniel. My father, Robert, was a mechanic. He didn't talk much, but when he did, he always had that direct way that made me want to listen. I used to spend afternoons in the shop with him, learning how to change oil, disassemble engines, and understand that even the most broken parts sometimes just needed patience to get back to working order. I remember him telling me, "Mike, fixing a car is like fixing life. You'll get your hands dirty, you'll get frustrated, but if you stay calm, you'll always find a way out." I wasn't a prodigy nor a problem child, I was just normal. I played basketball in school, not because I was the best, but because it made me feel like I belonged. I had a few close friends, Chris, who was my neighbor since I was little, and David, whom I met on the court. We spent hours talking about dreams that, deep down, we knew were bigger than ourselves. Chris said he was going to be a musician. David wanted to enlist in the army. I said I wanted to open a workshop with my father. It wasn't anything grand, but it was my dream. I liked the simple things. I remember summer nights sitting on the porch with my mother, drinking lemonade and listening to the crickets. She would always ask me, "Michael, you're going to be a good man, right?" I laughed and said, "Of course, Mom. I'll be the best." And at that moment I really believed it, but life isn't made up of dreams alone. When I was 17, my father fell ill. It wasn't sudden. It started with small coughs and shortness of breath, but we soon discovered it was something much more serious in his lungs. The workshop, which had always been our base, began to fail. I watched my mother struggle even more, trying to pay the bills, and I, just a teenager, felt helpless. It was during this phase that I started to associate with the wrong people. They weren't exactly monsters. They were kids like me, trying to survive. But they had a different perspective. They believed shortcuts were faster than hard work. I didn't get into this life because I was bad, but because I was desperate. I wanted to help around the house. I wanted my mother to have a break. I wanted my brother to have what I didn't have. But instead of fixing things, I ended up breaking them even more. I won't go into details now, but it was this path that led me to prison years later. But the point is, before all this, before the brand, I was just Michael, a son, a brother, a boy who dreamed of being a mechanic and laughed at his friends' silly jokes. After I left, this memory of my former self became my refuge. Whenever the weight of guilt or judgment crushed me, I tried to remember, you weren't born a criminal, you were born a good boy. Don't forget that. And that's precisely why that neighborhood party affected me so much. Because, for a few seconds, I thought I could be seen as a human being again, not as an ex-con, but as Michael, the neighbor, the friend, the guy who just wanted a second chance. But that night, as you will see, that is not exactly what happened. The first time I experienced what it meant to be marked by my past happened so suddenly that I still remember every detail. It was a hot July afternoon, and I was working at a small restaurant in the city, washing dishes. It wasn't my dream job, but for me it meant everything. It meant a chance to start over, to show that I could be different. The owner of the restaurant, the Mr. Thompson, had given me that opportunity a bit skeptically, but I grabbed it with both hands. I arrived early, cleaned every pot as if it were made of gold, and stayed late if necessary. Deep down, I believed that if I dedicated myself enough, people would start to see me for what I was doing now, not for what I had done in the past. That afternoon, things were busy. It was lunchtime, the restaurant was packed with people coming and going constantly. I was in the kitchen, my arms soaked with soap, when I heard loud voices coming from the dining room. At first, I ignored them, but suddenly I realized the topic was me. One of the waitresses, Ashley, had made some innocent comment, something like, "Michael works hard, he never stops." But then, at the next table, a customer I had never seen before answered loudly, "Of course you work hard. You don't want to go back to jail, do you?" The whole room burst into laughter. I froze. My arms went still in the hot water. It was as if all those pots and pans in front of me suddenly disappeared, and I was back before the judge, listening to the sentence. The kitchen felt small, suffocating. Ashley tried to change the subject, but the damage was already done. Others heard and began to whisper. I could feel the eyes piercing the walls, hitting me hard, as if I were an animal trapped on display. At that moment I realized that to the world I wasn't Michael, the dedicated employee. I wasn't the son who dreamed of opening a repair shop, nor the older brother who tried to set an example. I was Justo ex-con, and it hurt in a way no cold cell ever could. I finished my shift in silence. I didn't complain. I didn't respond. I washed every dish with shaking hands, but when I walked out the back door that night, I sat on the sidewalk and cried like a child. It wasn't just humiliation, it was helplessness. Because no matter what I did, no matter how many hours I worked, or how much honesty I put into every gesture, the past always appeared to pull me back. That was my first real wound. Because until then, I still believed I could simply erase my mistakes, turn the page, and write a new story. But there, that afternoon, I realized that for many people, I never had the right to change, and that began to eat away at me. Because it's one thing to pay your debt to justice, it's another to realize that society doesn't accept it. I had served my sentence, I had lost years of my life in a cell, but for them, none of that was enough. It was as if my sentence were eternal. After that day, the stares grew heavier. Every time I entered a place, I imagined people whispering. Even when they weren't, I felt as if they were. Shame clung to me like a shadow. I avoided dates, avoided parties, even avoided walking down the street during busy times. And the worst part is that in silence, I began to believe their words. I began to think, maybe they're right. Maybe I'll never be anything more than this. And that thought was an even greater prison than the bars that once surrounded me. But even though I was hurt, I didn't give up completely. There was still a small, stubborn part of me that said, "Hold on tight, Michael. Things will change eventually. They will see who you really are." The problem was that this hope was constantly crushed by moments like the one at the party. Because one humiliation at the restaurant wasn't enough. They came one after the other, as if the world took pleasure in reminding me of my scar. And that was how my wound first opened. Not with physical violence, not with screams of hatred, but with the laughter of strangers who reduced me to a label. That afternoon was etched in my mind. From then on, every step I took carried that pain, as if I were always walking on invisible shards of glass. After that first wound, I thought maybe it was just an isolated incident, something I could overcome with time. But it didn't take long for me to realize that life outside the prison would be a daily battleground. The conflict wasn't just in people's eyes, but in the heavy silence that accompanied me everywhere I went. It was like carrying a scar on my forehead, impossible to hide. I tried to convince myself that if I was patient and tried hard, things would change. But with every step, it seemed like the world was making a point of reminding me that I was different, that I no longer belonged. That Ohio summer was sweltering, and the city was in a festive mood. The neighborhood where I lived had a tradition of hosting a big community barbecue on the weekend. 4th of July fireworks, music, children running through the streets. It was the kind of event that always brought back fond memories of my childhood. I remember running barefoot with my brother Daniel, eating roasted corn, laughing without a care in the world. So when Chris, my old childhood friend, invited me to the party that year, I hesitated. A part of me wanted to say no, because I already knew what it would be like. Looks, whispers, maybe even nasty comments. But another part, the one that still struggled to believe in life, said to me, "Go, Michael. Show that you have nothing to hide. Show that you're just another neighbor, another guy trying to live in peace." And that's how I decided to go. That day, I wore my best shirt, a simple light blue one my mother had given me for Christmas. I spent some time fixing my hair in the mirror, as if that little detail would make a difference. I didn't want to look like someone trying to prove anything. I just wanted to be part of it, to laugh, to eat, to talk, to be human again. When I arrived, the backyard was already full. Red, white and blue balloons decorated the tables, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. Chris welcomed me with open arms, with that sincere smile of someone who never judged me. He's always been like that. A true friend, the kind who sticks around even when everyone else disappears. For the first few minutes, I even thought it would be different this time. I grabbed a plate, filled it with salad and meat, and stood near the table, trying to inconspicuously. Some people greeted me politely, others looked away. Nothing new. But deep inside, I still held on to that spark of hope. Maybe today is the day things change, but it didn't take long for the conflict to appear. While I was talking to Chris, I heard a group of men behind me. They were talking loudly, laughing, and I accidentally caught bits of their conversation. One of them said, "Look who decided to show up, the prison hero." Another replied, laughing even louder, "Better hide your wallets, guys." Their laughter cut like a knife. I pretended not to hear, but each word hit me hard. Chris looked at me with pity and tried to change the subject, but I could already feel my blood boiling, not because I wanted to react violently, but because it was unfair. I was there in peace, trying to belong, and they were determined to push me out. The situation worsened when a woman I knew by sight approached one of the tables with her young son. The boy, curious, asked something out loud. "Mommy, who is that man over there?" She answered without thinking twice, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Him? He's the criminal who lived here. Stay away." It was as if the ground had dropped out from under my feet. That boy looked at me with wide eyes, a mixture of fear and curiosity. I wanted to disappear. There was nothing I could say. How do you explain to a child that you're not just what they say? And then came the final blow. One of the men in the group, perhaps drunk, stood up, pointed at me and shouted, "No criminals here!" Silence fell over the party. Even the children stopped. Everyone looked at me. Some whispered, others just watched. But for me, it was like standing naked before an armed mob. In that instant, I felt my entire body tremble. My fingers were sweating, my throat was dry. The shame was so overwhelming I could barely breathe. All I wanted was to grab my things and leave. Because no matter how hard I tried, no matter how hard I struggled, they didn't see me as Michael. To them, I was just the criminal. That was the moment the conflict truly deepened. It wasn't just about looks or whispers anymore. It was a public, explicit rejection in front of everyone. I had no way to defend myself. If I screamed, I'd be proving I was unstable. If I fought, I'd be confirming what they were saying. So I stood still, my heart in pieces. The party continued after that, but for me there was no more music, no more laughter, no more smell of barbecue. There was only the weight of knowing that no matter how hard I fought, I was always one step away from being rejected again. And it was at that moment that I began to understand the depth of my conflict. It wasn't just me against others, it was me against the image they had of me. An image that no matter how hard I tried to erase was etched on the face of every person who looked at me. I thought about leaving. I thought about never showing up at events again, never trying to blend in again. But a stubborn part of me still said, "Stay. Hold on. You can't spend your life running away." And it was this decision to stay that led me to witness what happened next. Because in the midst of all that humiliation, something even more powerful was about to happen. That night had already been too much. The public humiliation, the finger-pointing, the word criminal echoing in the air like a never-ending sentence. It all crushed me inside. But what happened next was even more painful, because it wasn't just about how others saw me. It was about how I came to see myself. I clearly remember the moment I decided to leave the party. He was sitting near the fence, a glass of soda in his hands that had long since gone flat. I stared at him, as if he were the only thing keeping me in the present. The voices around me seemed distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. In my head there was only one sentence: "You don't belong anywhere." I stood up slowly, trying not to attract attention. My entire body felt heavy, as if each step were an effort. The gate was right there, just a few meters away. All I could think about was getting to it, crossing the street, and disappearing into the darkness. Maybe never going back to another event, never trying to fit in again. As I walked, flashes of my life flashed before me. I saw myself as a child, running through the same neighborhood, laughing with my brother Daniel. I saw myself as a teenager, in my father's workshop, dreaming of a simple future. I saw myself in court, listening to the judge bang his gavel. And now I saw myself as an adult, head bowed, carrying a shame that seemed endless. That's when despair truly set in. Because in that moment, I felt like my entire life was a mistake. No matter how hard I tried, how much effort I put in, people would always reduce me to that label. I wasn't Michael anymore. I was the ex-con. I stopped in the middle of the path and leaned against the fence, trying to breathe. The sounds of the party continued behind me, laughter, music, conversation. But to me, it all seemed distant, as if I were already outside of that place. A feeling of emptiness consumed me. I remember thinking, maybe it would be better if I weren't here anymore. Maybe it would be easier for everyone. This was the first time in a long time that the darkness truly tried to pull me in. I'd never been a coward, but I'd also never felt so small. The weight of the judgment was so heavy that it felt impossible to move forward. At that moment, if someone had asked me what I felt, I would have said just one word: failure. I failed as a son because I couldn't keep the promise I made to my mother to be a good man. Failure as a brother because I couldn't be the example Daniel needed. Failure as a citizen because no matter how hard I tried, I would never be accepted. I even failed as a human being because not even the right to exist in peace seemed to belong to me. I leaned against the fence, closed my eyes, and let the pain wash over me. It was my lowest point, my true breaking point. Because it wasn't just rejection from others anymore, it was my own rejection of myself. I felt like an imposter, an intruder, a mistake. I stood there for seconds that felt like hours. My heart was racing, my breath was shallow, my palms were sweating. I wanted to disappear. And maybe in that moment, if nothing had happened, I would have walked away and never looked back. But fate had other plans. Before taking the final step towards the gate, I heard something that cut through the silence inside me. A child's cry. It was strange, because amidst all the music, fireworks popping in the distance, and excited conversation, that sound seemed different, higher-pitched, more desperate. I opened my eyes, looked to the side, but saw nothing. Then, suddenly, I heard a panicked woman's voice. "Emily! Emily is missing! Where is my daughter?" Terror gripped the place. People began running from one side to the other, shouting the girl's name. The party, which seconds before had been pure joy, turned into chaos. And I stood there, watching everything, my heart racing. There, at my lowest point, at the very moment I was about to give up on myself, something unexpected arose, an opportunity. not to prove anything to others, but to remember who I truly was. Because deep down, despite all the scars, I was still that boy who wanted to be good, who wanted to protect, who wanted to care. And it was in this clash between my darkness and that mother's despair that a thread of hope was born. But before I could get there, I had to hit rock bottom. I had to feel the weight of total rejection, the emptiness of having no place in the world for the flame within me to rekindle. That cry, that scream, that lost child, it was the beginning of the turning point. When I heard that scream piercing the air, "Emily, Emily's missing!" Something inside me broke and at the same time ignited. I still had one foot outside the party, about to walk through the gate and disappear. But those words froze me. It was as if the world had stopped for a few seconds. I looked around. I saw the girl's mother, Sarah, running frantically between the tables, calling her daughter's name. Her face was filled with panic. I also saw the guests getting up, some trying to help, others just watching, unsure of what to do. And, strange as it may seem, in that instant, all the humiliation I had suffered minutes before vanished from my mind. It was as if nothing else mattered, not the criminal label, not the stares, not the whispers. There was only one thing: a child was missing. I know it may seem simple, but for me, it was like a flash in the pan. Because suddenly, I remembered what my dad always said in the workshop: "Mike, when all seems lost, look again. There is always a way to fix it." And maybe that was what I needed at that moment. A reason to get up, a wake-up call that reminded me that I could still do something good. My heart raced. I thought, I've been lost. I know what it's like to feel like no one can find you, no one can see you. If anyone can find that girl, it's me. And as people ran frantically, aimlessly, I took a deep breath and tried to focus. I remembered the neighborhood streets, the alleys, the places where I myself, as a child, used to hide when I wanted to escape the noise of the adults. I looked beyond the fence, down the dark side street that almost no one noticed. That street had always caught my attention because it opened onto a quieter area with tall grass and a small stream just beyond. I thought, if I were a child and I was scared or curious, maybe I would go there. Wasting no time, I crossed the yard. I felt a few eyes following me, but I ignored them. For the first time that night, I wasn't thinking about myself. I was thinking about her, Emily. With each step I took toward that dark street, the stronger the feeling that I was on the right path. The moon barely illuminated the ground, and the silence there was strange, heavy. Suddenly, in the midst of that darkness, I heard it, a soft, broken cry coming from somewhere nearby. My heart leaped into my throat. I followed the sound, dodging branches until I reached the creek, and then I saw it. Little Emily was there, sitting on the ground, her tiny foot wedged between two rocks. Her face was wet with tears, and her wide eyes showed pure fear. The moment she saw me, she tried to shrink away, frightened. And that hurt me deeply, because, even though she was just a child, perhaps she had already heard things about me. Perhaps she had already been taught to fear the neighborhood criminal. But I knelt down slowly, in the calmest voice I could muster. "Hey, Emily, it's okay. I'll get you out of here." She hesitated, sobbing but didn't scream. She just looked at me with that look of someone who wanted to believe in someone. And in that look, I found the spark I needed. Carefully, I pushed aside the rocks that had trapped her tiny foot. It was difficult, my hands scratched on the sharp edges, but I didn't care. When I finally managed to free her, she threw herself into my arms. That small, fragile embrace pierced me like an arrow. I held her tight, took off my coat and wrapped her up against the cold. And for the first time, in a long time, I felt like I was doing something no one could erase. I walked back to the party, carrying Emily in my arms. The noise grew louder as I approached, people still panicking, her mother crying desperately. When they saw me, silence fell again. I walked through the gate and stopped in the middle of the yard. Emily was leaning against my shoulder, still sobbing but holding on. I looked at Sarah, and she ran to us, tears streaming down her face. She scooped her daughter up in her arms and hugged her as if she would never let go. At that moment, I saw something change in people's eyes. The same group that minutes before had looked at me with contempt was now in shock, speechless, and I didn't need to say anything. My actions had already spoken for me. But more than that, something changed inside me. Because by saving that girl, I also saved a part of who I was, the part I thought had died, the part that wanted to protect, to help, to be useful. That was mine sign of hope, not because everyone suddenly accepted or loved me, but because I realized that no matter what they thought of me, I could still choose who I was. And for the first time in a long time, I chose to be someone who saves, not someone who destroys. When I handed Emily into her mother's arms, the entire yard fell silent. It was as if time had stopped. I could still feel the warmth of her little body on my shoulder, the sob stuck in her throat, and at the same time my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. Sarah hugged her daughter with a mixture of despair and relief. She cried unashamedly, clutching Emily to her chest, kissing her hair and repeating aloud, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, my God, thank you." I stood there, with my hands scratched and dirty with dirt, watching that scene, and that's when I realized everyone was looking at me. The same ones who minutes before laughed at me, whispered or shouted, "No criminals here." Now they were silent, their expressions ranging from shame to shock. I could feel their eyes boring into me, but for the first time, not with contempt. It was something different, an acknowledgement, maybe even respect. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to, because in that moment, my actions spoke louder than any justification I could give. Chris was the first to approach. He put his hand on my shoulder, squeezed it firmly, and simply said, "You saved her life, Mike." Those simple words struck me deeply, because suddenly, the entire narrative surrounding me, that I was just an ex-convict, a walking mistake, began to crumble in the face of reality. I wasn't the monster they painted me to be. I was someone capable of making a difference. But the most impactful thing wasn't how others looked at me. It was what happened inside me. Until that moment, I'd been drowning in shame and humiliation. Every insult, every laugh, every pointed finger seemed to crush me. But finding Emily, carrying her back, I realized something that changed me forever. I still had value. I could still be useful. I could still belong. And ultimately that was the real turning point. Not just how others began to see me, but how I began to see myself again. After Sarah had composed herself a bit, she stood up and came over to me. Her face was still wet with tears, her eyes red. She took a deep breath, placed her hand on my arm and said, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my daughter." I just nodded, speechless. But her gesture, her genuine gratitude, was like a balm on the wounds I carried. Meanwhile, I noticed the discomfort on the faces of some of those who had cursed me. The man who had yelled, "No criminal here." He was leaning against the table, staring at the floor, unable to raise his head. Others, who had previously laughed, now shifted uneasily, as if they were in front of a mirror that revealed their own cruelty. I didn't smile. I didn't feel vindicated, at least not then. What I felt was relief, because, for the first time in a long time, the truth had come out without me having to say a single word, and it's curious to think that life is like this. Sometimes we spend years trying to prove who we are, and no one believes us. But in an instant, one act, one choice can change everything. In that moment, I was no longer just the ex-con. I was the man who had saved Emily. The party wasn't the same after that. Sure, people tried to return to the music, the food, the laughter, but there was a different weight in the air, as if everyone was silently reflecting. I stayed quiet, leaning against a tree, trying to organize the turmoil inside me. Chris came to me again, carrying a bottle of water. He looked me in the eye and said, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore, Mike. They saw it with their own eyes." I wanted to believe it, but the truth is, change isn't instantaneous. I knew many would still judge me, that many would still see me through my past. But now there was a difference. I had shown that I was capable of more, and that for me was enough. In the days that followed, word spread through the neighborhood about the incident. People talked about how Emily had gotten lost and how I'd found her. Some even tried to downplay it, saying it was luck or that anyone would have done the same. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I'd seen the panic in their eyes that night. I knew that if it hadn't been for me, Emily might not have been found in time. And that's where the most beautiful part of the change comes in. I stopped caring so much about what people said. Because, for the first time, I had something bigger than other people's opinions. I had living proof that my choices could save lives. The weight was still there, of course. There were still those who looked at me suspiciously, who whispered behind my back. But I no longer bowed to it, because I knew who I was. The turning point for me was realizing that I didn't need their approval to move forward. My own awareness was enough. And that night, as I walked home, passing through the same dark street where I met Emily, I thought to myself, maybe I can't change what people think of me, but I can change what I think of myself. And that's what really matters. It was the beginning of my liberation. After that night, even with Emily safe, something hung in the air. It wasn't just relief or gratitude. It was a heavy, almost suffocating silence that showed there was still something unresolved. I could feel it in the way people looked away from me, as if wanting to thank me, but at the same time lacking the courage to face their own mistake. I knew the turning point had come within me. I had proven to myself that I could still be someone of value. But the world outside doesn't change so quickly. There were still open wounds. There was still injustice to be confronted. And this confrontation happened unexpectedly. A few days after the party, I was coming home from work. I was still at the same restaurant, washing dishes, doing what I could to keep myself together. I was walking down the neighborhood street, the sun already sinking below the horizon, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "No, Johnson!" I turned around. It was the same man who had shouted, "No criminals here," at the party. His name was Mark Davis. I knew him by sight. I knew he'd had more to drink than he should have that night. But the truth is, it wasn't just the alcohol. Mark always had that arrogant way about him, as if he were better than everyone else. He walked toward me, his steps firm. At first I thought he was going to attack me or humiliate me again. But there was something different in his gaze. It wasn't just anger, it was also shame. I need to talk to you," he said, hesitating. I remained silent, just waiting. That night, I overreacted. I said things I shouldn't have. Everyone saw what you did. You saved the girl. I wouldn't have dared to go down that dark street. You did. There was a pause. He took a deep breath and continued, "But I can't erase what I said. I can't erase what everyone heard. And to be honest, I still have my doubts, because people who have made mistakes often make them again." Those last words pierced me like a knife. I wanted to respond immediately, scream, tell him he had no right to judge me, that I had already paid for what I'd done. But instead, I took a deep breath. This was the confrontation I knew was coming, not just with Mark, but with everyone who thought like him. "Mark," I said firmly, looking into his eyes, "you're right. I made mistakes in the past. I made bad ones. But that doesn't define me anymore. You can spend your whole life calling me a criminal, but nothing will change the fact that I found Emily that night. Nothing will change the fact that when everyone was paralyzed, I acted. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and I will continue to do what's right, even if you never accept it." The silence was heavy. Mark stood there, unsure of what to say. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between the prejudice he carried and the truth he couldn't deny. And in that moment I understood something important. The confrontation wasn't physical. It wasn't about fighting or shouting. It was about facing others head-on, and most importantly, facing myself without fear. I didn't need to convince Mark. I didn't need to convince anyone. The real challenge was proving every day that I was more than my past. That same week, another incident occurred that reinforced this. Sarah, Emily's mother, approached me. She knocked on my door, holding her daughter's hand. Emily was still shy, but when she saw me, she smiled shyly and waved. Sarah took my hand and said, "Michael, I won't forget what you did. If you need me, if you need anything, I'll be here." Those words were more powerful than any public apology Mark could have given me, because they came from a place of truth. They came from the gratitude of a mother who nearly lost what she held most dear. The confrontation, for me, unfolded in layers. First, that direct clash with Mark, where I finally said out loud that I would no longer accept being defined by my past. Then the silent confrontation with the neighborhood's gaze, which now mixed distrust and respect. And finally, the most intimate confrontation with myself, with my own limiting beliefs. That week, I started sleeping better. Not because the world had suddenly changed, but because I had. For the first time, I could look in the mirror and see not only the scars, but also the strength that had been born from them. And that was the true climax of my story, understanding that the confrontation was not against others, but against the weight I carried within myself. Life has a strange way of giving back what we give. I always thought redemption was something distant, almost impossible for someone like me. After all, when you have a history like mine, it seems like there's no room for second chances. But after that night at the party, after saving Emily, something started to change. Not in the way I dreamed, but in the way I needed. At first, the neighborhood was divided. Some looked at me differently, with silent respect. Others, like Mark, still resisted, clinging to the label they'd always used against me. But the story spread, and the more it spread, the harder it became for those who hated me to maintain the story that I was just a worthless criminal. Poetic revenge didn't come in the form of a fight, nor a resounding victory. It came in everyday life, in small situations that became proof that I was no longer who they thought I was. A few days later, I went to the neighborhood supermarket. Before going in there was almost torture. I could feel the eyes weighing heavily on me, as if they expected me to steal something at any moment. But this time it was different. The cashier, a woman named Nancy, smiled when she saw me. It was a shy smile, but sincere. She said, "I heard about what you did for Emily." It was amazing. Those simple words had a huge effect on me. For the first time in years, someone from the neighborhood recognized me not for my past, but for my present. And with each passing day, little things like this began to happen. A child who had previously avoided me now greeted me on the street. A neighbor who had previously looked away now waved from afar. Even at the restaurant where I worked, I noticed a change. Customers who had previously whispered began treating me with more respect. Redemption didn't come from collective applause, but from these small gestures that showed me that I was rewriting my story. But poetic revenge, that came more clearly. A week later, there was a community meeting in the neighborhood. These meetings were always tense for me, because I knew that sooner or later someone would use the space to point to me as a negative example. But that night, something different happened. The topic was neighborhood safety. People were discussing ways to better protect children after the scare with Emily. Some suggested higher fences, others talked about hiring security. That's when Sarah stood up. With her daughter at her side, she asked to speak and in a firm voice said, "I want to publicly thank Michael Johnson. If my daughter is alive today, it's because he had the courage to do what no one else did. I don't care about his past. What matters is what he did that night, and I think everyone here should remember that." The room fell silent. I shrank back in my chair, feeling the eyes fall on me again. But this time, there was no contempt. There was discomfort, shame, reflection. Even Mark, who was present, couldn't hide his unease. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down, everyone knew Sarah was right. Poetic revenge happened there, in front of everyone, because those who humiliated me were forced to face the truth. The criminal they rejected was the same man who saved a child's life. I didn't need to say anything. I didn't need to shout or publicly apologize. My actions had already written the answer. And from that moment on, something broke in their narrative. Not that everyone immediately loved or trusted me, but it became impossible to reduce me to just my past, because there was living proof, Emily, that I could be different. For me, this was the greatest redemption, not to erase the past, because that is impossible, but to write something so powerful in the present that even the hardest of hearts would be forced to see it. And you know what was most curious? I didn't feel hate. I didn't feel the urge to avenge every cruel word, every dirty look. What I felt was peace, because finally I realized I didn't need to carry that war inside me. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. It was already proven. The poetic revenge wasn't against them. It was against the pain they instilled in me, because I managed to transform that pain into something greater, into something that freed me. In the following days, I began walking the streets with my head held high, not because everyone accepted me, but because I finally accepted myself, and that for me was the true victory. After everything that happened, I realized that life isn't about what people say about you, nor even what happened in your past. Life is, above all, what you choose to be in the present. For a long time, I allowed myself to be imprisoned by a label, criminal. That word weighed on my shoulders like an invisible chain, stifling my steps, shaping my identity. I believed there was no way out, that no matter how hard I tried, I would never see beyond my mistake. But that night changed everything. When I heard Sarah scream for her daughter, when I found Emily frightened at the edge of the stream, I realized there was still a spark inside me that no one could extinguish. And when I carried her back in my arms, I realized my life wasn't doomed to be just a memory of prisons and trials. I could be remembered for something good. After that, I began to reflect on the difference between freedom and redemption. I had been free for some time, but I didn't truly feel free, because the real prison wasn't the cell I'd lived in years ago, but the feeling that I would never be forgiven, never accepted. And that night, I finally understood that the key to this prison had always been in my hands. I couldn't force anyone to accept me. I couldn't control the looks, the whispers, the judgments, but I could control my choices. I could decide who I wanted to be from then on, and I chose to be different. I chose not to seek revenge with violence, not to feed the hatred that so often weighed me down. I chose to act with dignity, even when treated as if I were worthless. I chose that every time they called me a criminal, I would respond with actions that demonstrated the exact opposite. This choice didn't erase the past. It remains there, marked within me, in my scars, in my mistakes. But it's no longer a prison. It's become just part of my story. A hard part, but one that brought me here. And do you know what the greatest lesson I've learned is? That no one is just what they did wrong. We are also what we do after the mistake. We are the choices we make every day. That party, which began with shame and humiliation, ended as a turning point in my life. Because it was there that I realized that my identity didn't need to be defined by what I lost, but by what I could still offer. It wasn't easy. To this day, when I walk the streets, I feel suspicious glances. There are still those who will never forgive me, who will always reduce me to the cruelest label. But the difference is that it no longer paralyzes me, because I learned to walk even under those gazes, with my head held high, knowing that my worth doesn't depend on anyone's approval. Some people have changed with me. Sarah, for example, has become a true friend. Every time she sees me, she thanks me again, as if time weren't enough to express how much that meant. Chris remains my soul brother, the guy who was there for me from the beginning. Even some neighbors, previously cold and distant, have started to strike up conversations. But above all, I changed myself. Today, when I look in the mirror, I don't just see an ex-convict. I see a man who fell, made mistakes, but got back up. I see someone who hit rock bottom and found the strength to climb back up. I see someone who still bears scars, but who has learned to transform them into memories of overcoming obstacles. And when I think about all this, I remember a scene from that night. After I handed Emily over to her mother and walked away a bit, I stopped near the gate. The same gate that, minutes before, I had almost crossed to escape. Only this time when I looked at it, I didn't feel like running away. On the contrary, I felt ready to stay, and when I finally left, walking down the dark street, something inside me calmed. It was as if I'd closed a circle, as if, by walking through that gate, I'd left behind not only the party, but also the invisible prison I'd carried within me. I'll never forget the feeling, the cold wind hitting my face, the silence of the night around me, and the knowledge that, for the first time in a long time, I was free. Truly free. Not free from the past, because it will always be with me, but free from the need to prove to everyone that I've changed, because the only person I needed to prove it to was myself, and I proved it. Today, when someone asks me who I am, I don't say ex-convict. I say I'm Michael Johnson. I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a friend. I'm someone who made mistakes, but chose not to make them again. I'm someone who saved a life. And above all, I'm someone who didn't give up on himself. And this is what I want to convey. No matter how low you've fallen, no matter how harsh the judgment of others, there's always a chance to start over. There's always a path to redemption. Sometimes all it takes is a choice. Sometimes all it takes is an act. For me, that act was saving Emily. For you, it might be something else. But never forget, you are not just what you did. You are also what you decide to do from now on. And that night, when I closed the gate behind me, I felt that finally I was free.